Welcome to swords and hammers, where truth comes clothed in tales, and the soul remembers what the mind forgets. The world is loud, but for these few minutes it can wait. Settle in and listen well. The Winter of Knowing. A tale from an old woman's memory. I am old now. The winters come harder than they once did. My hands, which once spun wool and kneaded bread and held a child who was more than a child, have grown stiff and spotted with age. I sit by the small fire in my room in Nazareth, and outside the wind moves through the olive trees like something searching. The others have gone to sleep, but I remain awake, as I often do in these late years. There is much to remember. People come to me sometimes, the young ones, asking what it was like. They want to hear about angels and stars, about shepherds running breathless through the night. They want the wonder, and I do not blame them for it. But when they leave, I sit alone and think of different things. I think of the years no one asks about, the hidden years, we might call them now. 30 winters and 30 summers of watching a boy grow into a man, knowing what the angel had said, and yet seeing him stub his toe and cry, hearing him laugh at the antics of the village donkeys and dogs. I remember how he would fall asleep against my shoulder when he was small, his breath warm and even, and I would look at his face and try to find the Almighty there. Sometimes I found him. Most often, I simply found my son. I remember the night the messenger came. I was younger than most brides in our village. I had been grinding grain and my arms ached from the work. The room filled with a light that had no source, and I knew before he spoke that nothing in my life would ever be ordinary again. But here is what they do not tell you. Even the extraordinary must be lived through day by day. Even the impossible must be fed and clothed and taught to walk. Joseph understood this, I think, better than anyone. He was a quiet man, the kind who measured twice before cutting and thought carefully before speaking. The scriptures record not a single word he spoke. This would have suited him. He never asked me to explain what the angel had said. He had his own dreams to wrestle with. I loved him. I loved his steadiness, the way he nodded when I spoke, as if my words genuinely mattered. His hands were rough from his work, and he smelled of cedar shavings and honest sweat. I have thought often about him, when God chose a man to raise his only begotten son, for reasons entirely his own. Joseph. I remember, and I miss him. We made our way to Bethlehem in the cold season, following the emperor's decree. Like sheep following a shepherd, they cannot see. My body was heavy with the child, and each step sent pain through my hips and spine. Thankfully, I rode upon our donkey, Joseph walking beside me, saying little, his hand always finding mine whenever the road grew rough. I remember thinking that perhaps this was how all great things came into the world. Not in palaces, but on dusty roads, carried by tired people who did not fully understand what they were carrying. The stable was tucked into a small cave that smelled of animals and old straw. I have heard it said that it was holy ground. Perhaps, but to me, it smelled very much like a stable. I had said yes to the angel. I had said, "Let it be to me, according to your word." And in that moment, it had felt like wings, like being lifted high above the earth, frightening and exciting. now in the dark, with the straw beneath my knees and pain like I had never felt before. I learned what my yes would cost. The pain came in waves, and I gripped Joseph's hand until both of our knuckles whitened. My mother had told me years ago that the courage of women is the courage that labors through the night with no guarantee of dawn. I had never understood what that meant. I learned that night. And then he was here, small and slick and crying the way all newborns cry. Joseph cut the cord with his knife, the same knife he used for shaving wood. The plainness of it struck me like a blow. This child was the Son of the Most High, and he entered the world through blood and pain, dependent on a carpenter's blade. He was hungry, as any child is hungry. I held him against my chest, and he quieted. His fingers were impossibly small, curled like new fern fronds, and when he opened his eyes, they were dark and unfocused. This was the paradox I would live inside for 33 years. The hands that had flung stars across the void now grasped at my finger and held tight. I wrapped him in the cloths I had brought from Nazareth, the ones my mother had helped me prepare. The manger was rough-hewn, full of old hay, and we laid him there because there was nowhere else, nothing but a trough meant for beasts. The shepherds came, later that night, 4 of them, smelling of sheep, lanolin, and wood smoke. Philip, the oldest, told us of angels filling the sky like a second firmament, and I treasured his words, though I could not fully grasp them at the time. I was too tired, too emptied out by what my body had just accomplished. Later, years later, I would turn their account over in my mind, like a smooth stone, wearing it into the shape of understanding. But that night I only nodded and pulled my son closer to my warmth. The wise men came later, with their strange gifts, gold for a king, incense for a priest, and myrrh, which is used to prepare bodies for burial. I accepted the myrrh with both hands and said nothing, but something in me went cold and quiet, like a pond freezing from its depths upward. I understood, even then, that I was not raising a child who would outlive me. Time passed until we received warning to go. We fled to Egypt in the dark hours, Joseph shaking me awake with urgency in his eyes. I wrapped the baby in all the cloth we had and held him against my heart as we traveled. The stars overhead seemed indifferent and cold. I thought of all the other mothers in Bethlehem whose children would not see another dawn. I wept for them, silently, so as not to wake the child. Their grief would become a story people told. My escape would become a story too. But stories do not capture the cracked lips, the fear that tastes like iron, the way your arms ache from holding one small life against the darkness. We returned to Nazareth when the danger had passed, and there we lived and made our home. It was a small house, a wonderful house. Joseph had built it with his own hands, cozy and warm, smelling of sawdust and freshly baked bread. I watched him learn to walk, then to run, then working alongside Joseph, learning to be a carpenter. He was obedient, the scriptures say, and this is true. But obedience in a child who contains the fullness of all authority is a strange and wonderful thing. I remember once, when he was perhaps 7 or 8, he cut his hand on a chisel. The blood ran red and ordinary, and I cleaned and bound the wound while he winced, and I thought, with a strangeness I cannot fully describe, that this blood would one day redeem fallen man. But that afternoon it only stained my cloth, and I hung it to dry in the sun, like any piece of laundry. The hardest thing was not the birth, nor the flight, nor even the years of watching and wondering. The hardest thing was learning to let go. When he was 12, we lost him in Jerusalem, and I felt my heart would burst with panic. We found him in the temple, speaking with learned men, as though he had always belonged there. "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" he asked. And I heard in those words the first footsteps of his departure. A mother's work is always to release what she has been given. I had been given more than most. I would, in time, have to release more than most. Joseph died before our son began his public work. I was glad of this, in a strange sort of way. Joseph had carried so much in silence. He deserved to rest before the coming storm. We buried him in the hill country, and I went home to wait for what would come. When Jesus finally left, walking away down the road toward the Jordan, I stood in the doorway until I could no longer see him. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. But I had my memories. I kept them like seeds stored for a long winter. I followed him when I could. I saw him heal the sick and open blind eyes, and speak words that made fishermen leave their nets forever. I saw the crowds swell and then turn. I saw the hatred gather like thunderclouds. And I was there, at the very end, beneath the wood where they hung him. The myrrh the wise men brought had been a prophecy I had carried for over 30 years. Now it spoke its final meaning. I watched my son die, and it was exactly as terrible as I had always known it would be. The sky darkened as though creation itself could not bear to look. I cannot fully explain the agony of watching my son die. Words are simply not big enough or painful enough. But I remember. Here is what I learned, standing in that darkness. God does not ask us to understand. He asks us to remain. It was 3 days later. The women came running with impossible news. The tomb was empty. He was alive. I wept, but the tears were different now. All those years of pondering and treasuring had not been in vain. The child I had carried was carrying all of us, and had been all along. He appeared to me, though the scriptures do not record it. He stood in the doorway of my small house, and the morning light came through him and around him, and he smiled the same smile I had seen 1,000 times when he was small. "Mother," he said, and in that word was every moment we had shared, and every moment we would share forever. Now I am old. My body often aches, but I am not empty, as I once feared I would be. I am full. Fuller than I was, even when I carried him beneath my heart. He is not gone, you see. He is more present now than when I could touch him. I feel him in the bread I break, in the prayers I whisper, in the wind moving through the olive trees, like something searching, and finding, and staying. This is the truth I have learned through all my years of watching and waiting. The hands that once flung stars across the void still hold me close. They held me when I was a frightened girl grinding grain in Nazareth. They held me in the cold stable so many years ago. They held me on the dark road to Egypt, and beneath the cross, where hope itself seemed to die. They hold me now in this small room, in this long winter. As I wait to see his face again, let the young ones ask about angels and stars. Let them wonder at shepherds and wise men. These things are true, and they matter. But the deepest truth is simpler still. Jesus came, he stayed, and he stays, and that is enough. For any mother, for any soul, for any winter that seems it will never end. Selah.